Okay, everybody, thanks for joining me tonight for the learning of Parashat Hashavua, Parashat Vaera. Be'ezrat Hashem, we would like to dedicate tonight's learning for the Refuah Shlema of Kol Cholei Israel, especially Nejat Lavet Tavus, Rabbi Baruch ben Sivya, Malkiel ben Soraya, Menachem ben Khorshid, and Kol Cholei Israel. Whoever needs a Refuah Shlema, Hashem should send it to them very quickly, very soon. Okay, so every year we learn something new. Baruch Hashem, we learn the parasha again and again, and there's never a year that you don't go through the parashiot, even though you may have seen them before, learned them before, but there's always new things to learn and to grow from. So Baruch Hashem, tonight is no different. First thing I'm going to jump into is the pasuk that reveals in this week's parasha who were the parents of Moshe. And the Parashat talks about this in Parashat Shemot, but it doesn't say their names. It says Ish mi bet Levi, right? Vayikach et bat Levi. A man from the house of Levi took the daughter of Levi. But in this week's Parashat, it tells us who they actually were. And, of course, it was none other than Amram, who was the father of Moshe, who married Yocheved, his aunt, his father's brother, right? So over here, we have a very interesting discussion because the pasuk says over here, "Vateled lo," she gave birth to him, right? To him, meaning for him, et Aharon ve'et Moshe. She gave birth for him, right? It's Aaron and Moshe. Now, this is an interesting pasuk. It says like, "Vayikach Amram et Yocheved adato." Amram took Yocheved, his aunt. So it specifically mentions this is his aunt. This is the brother of his. This is the sister of his father. Lo leisha, as a wife. Vateled lo et Aaron. She gave birth to him she gave birth to Aaron and Moshe, right? And of course, also Miriam, she's not mentioned here, but we know Miriam as well. And Rav Steinman, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, asks an interesting question. Why does it say Vateled lo? She gave birth for him to two sons, Aaron and Moshe. Obviously, this is her husband, Amram. What does it mean she gave birth for him? Vateled lo. She gave birth for Amram. Et Aaron ve'et Moshe. Obviously, Amram married her. They're his kids. I saw a very interesting answer in a sefer called Az Yashir. And in order to understand this answer, he brings a Targum Yonatan ben Uziel. Targum Yonatan ben Uziel is found in Parashat Be'alotcha. And over there, in Parashat Be'alotecha, it talks about two people, Eldad and Medad, and how these two fellows, Eldad and Medad, were receiving prophecy in the encampment of the Jewish people. So it says the following, Vayisharu shnei anashim b'machaneh. There were two men who were left behind in the encampment. Shema echad, one was named Eldad, v'shema sheni Medad, the other one was named Medad. Now pay careful attention to what this Targum Yonatan is going to say. Very interesting. So it says like this, V'ishtayaru terein guvrin b'mashrita, two men were left behind in the camp. Shmei dechad Eldad v'shmei tinyan Medad. The one was named Eldad, their other one was named Medad, benoi de Elitzafan bar Parnach. They were the sons of Elitzafan, the son of Parnach. Now here's the key. Diledat le Yocheved berat Levi, that Yocheved, the daughter of Levi, gave birth to these two boys while she was married to Elitzafan, the son of Parnach, Bizman de Patra Amram Gavra, while Amram, her husband, had divorced her, and she got married to him, Adela Yeledat Yat Moshe, and before Moshe was born. So it turns out over here something very interesting according to this Targum Yonatan ben Uziel. Targum Yonatan ben Uziel is telling us something very interesting. It's telling us that you should know Eldad and Meidad, who were prophets that received this very interesting prophecy way later in Parashat Beha'alotecha, were actually the half siblings of Aharon, Miriam, and Moshe. They shared the same mom, but they had a different dad. Aharon, Miriam, and Moshe had Amram as their father. But Eldad and Meidad had Elitzaphan, the son of Parnach, as their father. So now this is a very interesting thing. We all know, so interesting. We all know that Amram, who was the Gdol Ador, divorced his wife, Yocheved, because of the decree of Paro. Because of what was going on with Paro, that Paro said that all the baby boys that are born must be thrown into the Nile River and killed. So Amram said, no, I'm sorry. I'm not going to be married to you, or to anybody for that matter, while we go ahead and take those babies that are born and throw them into the Nile River. I'm not interested. So he divorced her. Now, interestingly enough, what the Targum Yonatan ben Uziel is saying is that Elitzaphan ben Parnach said, well, now she is divorced. Let me go and remarry. Let me go and marry her. So she'd get remarried to me. At which point he did, and they had two babies, Eldad and Meidad. Now, at this point in time, the Targum Yonatan ben Uziel says Moshe wasn't yet born, which means that if Amram is the father of Moshe, as we know he is, as it tells us multiple times, right? So then in that case, it means that Elitzaphan ben Parnach divorced her as well. And then she remarried her original husband, Amram, which is so interesting. Because it's interesting, this whole thing is really interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, if there's a decree not to be married, meaning the Gdol Ador Amram decreed not to be married, so then you think that he's he would follow that, right? But apparently it's possible that they felt that that was the wrong thing to do. Maybe they felt that, like Miriam told her father, Miriam said, you decreed against everybody. Paro decreed only on the boys, but by you not having children, you're not even bringing girls into the world. So it could be Elitzaphan felt that way, and that's why he got married to her. But just an interesting thing to think about, the idea that Yocheved was married to Amram, divorced Amram, got married to Elitzaphan ben Parnach, had two children, Eldad and Meidad, got divorced again, and then went ahead and remarried her first husband, Amram, which, as you know, is a big Vaera according to Torah. According to Torah, there is no such thing as a husband and wife getting divorced, the wife getting remarried to somebody else, getting divorced from him, and then getting remarried to the first husband. It says lo yuchal, right? The first husband, lo yuchal. I forgot the exact language of the pasuk. Lo yuchal abal. I don't know exactly how it says. The point is that it says clearly he's not allowed to remarry the woman that he divorced after she got married to some other guy. So that's an interesting thing. You also have to ask, a much more basic question, which I guess we should have started off with this. It turns out that it's Amram and his aunt, which again also is a big question. According to Torah, a nephew, under no circumstances, is allowed to marry his father's sister. It doesn't exist. It's asur. Let's take it a step further. What happens if that does happen? What happens if they do have children? According to Torah, those children are mamzerim. It's an amazing thing what happened over here. So it's so interesting that the leaders, the greatest leaders of Klal Yisrael, if they would have been born after the Torah was given, then they would be born in a status of mamzer, which is like, it's wild to even think about that. Yet they were on the highest level that we ever know, have ever known in the history of mankind. So how does this happen? How does this exactly work out? So these are obviously famous questions in general. We know that the Torah was kept by all of the generations even before the Torah was given, as it says about Avraham Avinu already. Vayishmor mishmarti mitzvotai chukotai v'torotai. Avraham kept not only the positive commandments, the negative commandments, he kept everything. Not only that, it says he kept even the mitzvot derabanan, the rabbinical rules that weren't even established yet. He knew about them and kept them as well. So being that that's the case, you have to ask yourself, well, then how does this work out? How does Amram marry his aunt? How does he get divorced from her? Then she remarries somebody else, gets divorced from him, and then remarries the first husband. That is we know we can't do that. So how does that work? So the answer is there are many answers to this question. I mean, this goes along the same line as asking about how could Yaakov Avinu marry two sisters, etc. But let's talk about these things for a little bit. The first answer I'm going to share with you comes from the Maharal of Prague in the Gur Aryeh. And the Maharal says that although they kept Kol HaTorah Kula, although they kept everything in the entire Torah, but sometimes based on Ruach HaKodesh, based on divine inspiration, again, we're dealing with extremely holy people. So based on divine inspiration from what they understood, they were aware that this union would produce something that is very important for the Jewish people. And therefore, they felt that it was appropriate to do that. So in other words, even though they kept all the rules of the Torah, but being that they were not obligated in the rules of the Torah, they felt that sometimes certain factors may outweigh the necessity to keep the Torah because of the considerations that they were aware of. They felt that those considerations took more importance. We don't have that liberty, meaning now that we are obligated in every single thing of the Torah, we don't have the liberty to say, well, this consideration, that consideration. We don't have that. We don't have that liberty to do that. But they did because they weren't obligated yet, and therefore they said, we see in Ruach HaKodesh that this union would produce a Moshe Rabbeinu. So even though it's it's after she already was remarried to somebody else and she got divorced, I can remarry her because it's going to produce a Moshe Rabbeinu. Even though she's my aunt, I see it's going to make a Miriam and an Aaron. So therefore, I could do it based on Ruach HaKodesh. Then the Maharal says something very interesting as well. He says, sometimes, as we know, the mitzvah of Peru Uruvu was an obligation for them at the time. As already Hashem told Adam and Chava, you have a mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. And that mitzvah of Peru Uruvu was indeed an obligation. And the Maharal says, not necessarily does a person have an easy time fulfilling that mitzvah from a particular woman. Sometimes he's not able to do it with a particular woman, but he is able to do it with a different one. And it's very possible that he knew that with this woman, Yocheved, who happened to be his aunt, he would indeed be able to reproduce. So although it's true that she was remarried to somebody else in the middle, but the mitzvah of Peru Urvu, which he wanted to continue to fulfill, I guess by having more children, again, he already had Miriam and he had Aaron, so technically, I guess according to Bet Hillel, he did the mitzvah, maybe according to Bet Shammai, he didn't yet. So the point being, he wanted to still do this mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to have more children, even if you already did do the mitzvah of Puruvu. But the point is, even as it may, he felt that he understood that he could do this mitzvah with Yocheved, and therefore he felt that that was an appropriate thing to do. Okay, now, there's a very interesting discussion about this, which is that according to the Ramban, As you know, the Ramban addresses this question of how could Yaakov Avinu marry two sisters, Rachel and Leah. So he suggests one. He gives a bunch of answers. One of the answers that he gives is that Yaakov Avinu did what he did outside of Israel. Meaning, where is it so that Avram kept the Torah and all the mitzvot and all the rabbinic rules, etc.? That's in the land of Israel. And Yitzchak was in the land of Israel. And so was Yaakov while he was in the land of Israel. But when he left Israel, he no longer had that obligation. And for that reason, he was able to marry two sisters. So this is an interesting question now. In this context, there would be really no question as to why it is that Amram married his aunt, and how could she remarry somebody else, and then get married to her first husband again? Because again, this is all happening outside of Israel, right? But the problem with this is that it doesn't seem to be correct. Because and then the proof is the following. It says in the Midrash Tanchuma brings it down, other Midrashim bring it down as well. It says, how come Hashem brought the plague of blood on the Egyptians? So it says that Hashem brought the plague of blood on the Egyptians because this plague was to remind the Egyptians, midah kineged midah, measure for measure, the fact that the Egyptians wanted to target the childbearing, the birth of the ladies. As you know, the women were giving birth 6 in one shot, and 6 babies, sextuplets every single time. They were becoming very large. They were becoming a huge people. Paro didn't want that to be the case. He wanted to inhibit their childbearing abilities, and therefore he did not allow women to dip in the mikveh in order to prevent them from being with their husbands. So midah kineged midah, measure for measure, since Paro did not allow them to get rid of the blood of their menstruation, meaning the tum'ah that came about because of it. Since that was the case, so Hashem punished them with their water that they should have dipped in. It became all blood, right? Midah kineged midah, measure for measure. Now wait a second. According to that Ramban, there's a big problem now. The Ramban told us, you want to know why Yaakov Avinu could marry 2 sisters? Very good, I'll tell you why. Because he was outside Israel. When did they keep the Torah? Before Har Sinai, in Israel. Outside Israel? No such thing. Question, they're outside Israel. Why aren't they with their husbands during Nidah? There is no Torah yet, and they're outside the land of Israel. So you see that it's a little bit of a tricky answer to give. So I did see one sefer called Az Yashir, and he brings down a very interesting answer to this question. He says that there's an interesting point brought down from Maran HaChida. This is in his sefer Midbar Kedemot, Ma'arechet Yud Nun Hey. So the Chida, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha, says the following very interesting answer. He says that the idea that the Ramban is saying, and he quotes this from his father, who heard it from the Ri Ze'evi. He says the Ri Ze'evi said that the idea that they only kept the Torah Kedosha in the land of Israel was so long as there was a plan to be in the land of Israel. Meaning, Yaakov Avinu knows that for the time being he's outside of Israel, so therefore he doesn't need to keep the Torah right now because he's outside Israel. He can marry 2 sisters. But he has a plan to go back to Israel and continue to live his life there, so therefore he will come to a point where he's doing it all over again. However, at this time, when Yosef had realized that now we are at a different stage of life, of the nation, that at this point already, it's no longer going to be that we're going back to Israel, because the opposite. We're going to be in Egypt now for a very long time, and we're not going anywhere. We're going to be slaves here. We're going to be here for hundreds of years. So at that point, Yosef HaTzadik accepted upon himself to keep the Torah even outside of Israel. So he says, since Yosef knew they're going to stay in Chutz La'aretz, Yosef accepted to keep the mitzvot even outside of Israel, and not only himself, but all of the Jewish people at that point accepted to do so even outside of Israel as well. And that's how this idea that they were keeping the laws of Nida and the evil of Paro to keep them away from each other was punished by the plague of blood, because you remind them, you didn't let them become Torot from their dam Nida, from their blood of Nida. So that's a very interesting discussion. So for that reason, it still would be a problem. How come Amram married his aunt, and how come she got remarried, etc., to the first husband after she was married to somebody else? And the answer is, like the Maral said, Ruach HaKodesh of the great tzaddikim, that they understood that this was something that was important enough for them to do, and therefore they went ahead and did it out of consideration for that importance, even though today we don't have that flexibility or that liberty to make those considerations, but nevertheless, we still do it. Nevertheless, they had the right to do it, and therefore it was permissible for them to do so. Now, just while we're on the subject of the idea of the importance of husband and wife being together, so really we talk about this in the Haggadah. It says, "Vayaret onyenu." We say in the Haggadah that Hashem saw our suffering. Hashem saw our affliction. Vayaret onyenu. And it says, Zu perishut derech eretz. This refers to the fact that the Jewish people could not function in the way of the world, derech eretz, which means that husband and wife could not be together. And that was considered to be suffering. That was considered to be something that was tantamount to suffering. Now, Rabotai, it's important. We're in the weeks of Shovavim right now. It's important to be aware that for husband and wife to be together is of paramount importance. It cannot be oversimplified. It cannot be stressed enough. It has to be very clear to us that this is so important, that when they are apart from each other, that's called an affliction. It's called onyenu. Onyenu means suffering, right? It's very interesting to note that the mitzvah that a husband has to be with his wife says in the Torah, she'era kesuta ve'onata lo yigara. The word ona means the mitzvah for a husband to be with his wife. And ona, very interestingly, this I heard from Rabbi Moshe Meir Weiss beautifully pointed out, ona is also very similar. It's the same root as inui, which means affliction, suffering. Meaning, if you are not performing the mitzvah of ona, you're not taking care of your marital responsibility, so then that's an affliction for the other person. Out of the couple, if one of them is holding off from the other one, it's considered to be an act of affliction. That's why, very interesting, again, the same word in Hebrew, in Gemara language, the act of relations is bia, to be together. Those letters are the same. Bet Yud Aleph Hey is the very same letters as Eva. Eva means Aleph Yud Bet Hey, which means hatred. Meaning, if it's not there, God forbid, it could cause hatred between the couple. And the opposite, if it is there, so then you have Ba Yud Hey. Ba Yud Hey, it means Hashem is there, Hashem has come, Hashem has arrived. Because the act of the couple being together actually brings the third partner, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's so important to be aware of the significance of and the importance of this and the damage that was done by Paro for separating them. That's why Hashem made such a big point of bringing the blood onto the Mitzrayim. Nobody had any water, because look what you did. You separated husbands and wives from being together. And that's why it says, Bischut Nashim Tzidkaniot, in the merit of the great women of Egypt, that were suffering so much. And who has the state of mind, the peace of mind, the frame of mind to be able to do anything under the circumstances that they were in? But they still made a Herculean effort to go ahead and make themselves beautiful for their husbands, that they should be able to still procreate And in that zechut, we got redeemed from Egypt. We wouldn't have a nation without those nashim tzidkaniot. So it's so important to be aware of how important, especially during this time, during Shalavim, to increase the shalom bayit between husband and wife. That's why, Rabotai, there's an interesting Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Kuf Nun Bet. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbat talks about how Rabbi Yehuda Anasi saw Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta. And he said to Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, who was at this point old, advanced in his age, and he said to him, how come the master didn't come to greet us like our forefathers went to your forefathers? In other words, a nice way of saying, why didn't you come to see me? I haven't seen you in a while. And Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta said to him, well, I want you to know, at my age, things are a little bit different. He says, everything is a lot taller than it used to be. In other words, I can't step over things. It's not so simple for me. Everything that's close by seems like it's much further away. He says, a 2-minute walk takes me half an hour, right? It's not the same. And then he throws him a line that's very important. He says, and being that I'm at my old age, you should know, Mesim shalom babayit batel. That which brings peace to the home is not working anymore, he says to him. So in other words, there's a difficulty in my life now. That which used to resolve conflict between me and my spouse, that which used to make peace between me and my wife, has ceased to work. So it's not as easy for shalom bayit anymore. What is he referring to? Rashi says, Ever Tashmish, his reproductive organ doesn't function the way that it used to. And therefore, he's not able to have shalom bayit in the home as much anymore. This is something very important. It's important to be aware that it's in the letters itself. Without the bi'ah, there's eva. Without the companionship between the husband and wife, without their intimacy, there is hatred. It's a big problem. So that's what he said. Mesim shalom babayit. That which used to make peace in my home, batel, stop functioning. Rabotai, this is a very important lesson for us. The importance of shalom bayit, how it brings so much beracha to a person, and the importance of intimacy in a marriage is also extremely important as well. And when Paro prohibited them from doing that, and prohibited them from having children and procreating, so he was punished severely for what he did. Now, let's think of the flip side, because it says, Michlal Lav ata shomea hen. From what it says not to do, you understand what yes to do. When a person goes ahead and makes peace between husband and wife, makes shalom bayit between husband and wife, that is the most incredible mitzvah that a person can do. Or let's say even more than that, when somebody is able to introduce somebody to a spouse and to make a shidduch, that is huge, that is tremendous. You're enabling people to do the mitzvah of Peru Ruvu, first of all. But more so, you're enabling people to have peace and love and harmony, something that Hashem wants very much. Rabotai, think of it this way. When Aaron HaKohen passed away, it's brought down, there were 80,000 children named Aharon that did the mitzvah of Levaya, that escorted his coffin, that were crying over him. And why were they all named Aaron? Because Aaron was the man of peace. He was the man that made peace between couples. And when they realized what this man had done for them, how here's the leader of the Jewish people, he's been the leader for years. Even before Moshe, he was leading the Jewish people in Egypt for so many decades. And this man is taking of his time to make peace between a couple. And they realize that. And then they have a child. The only person they want to name their kid after is Aaron. And how 80,000 marriages, this man saved 80,000 different marriages. I mean, you can understand what the magnitude of that is, to keep a couple happy together. Tremendous. So, Rabotai, that over here is something that we cannot understate. We have to mention it again and again and again. The idea and the importance of God forbid, to have an affliction, not vayaret on yenu. Hashem shouldn't see any suffering amongst people, but rather Because as you know, if there's no shalom bayit, then one of the two people is at least one of them is suffering, if not both of them. So therefore, we shouldn't have any of these types of afflictions. God forbid, but rather there should be shalom, there should be peace in people's homes. Okay, now moving along. Again, there's always so much to speak about in this subject. We just spoke about the idea that they had 6 in every pregnancy, 6 children. If you do the numbers, it comes out very interesting. There was a very interesting story between Rabbi Eliezer Gordon and an individual that he went to collect money from in Europe. Rabbi Eliezer Gordon was the Rosh Yeshiva of Telz. And this guy that he went to collect money from for his yeshiva said, I don't understand. Why do I have to support a place where they're studying and learning Torah all day long? What's the idea of that? Right? Why do I have to support that? I don't get it. So he went on to explain to him, this fellow went on to say to the rabbi, he says, I don't understand you. I could see certain things I can understand on my own, certain things, and I don't even need, he says to him the following. He says, it says that they had 6 kids every time, right? He says, I don't need there to be 6 kids every time. If you ask me, there were so many generations from the time that the Jews got to Egypt until they left. He says, without a problem, I could get you to 600,000 Jews without them having 6 kids every single time. So Rabbi Eliezer Gordon said to him, you have a good calculation. You're right, you could get to more than 1 million, but don't you realize they lost 80% of the people in the plague of darkness? So he said, I don't believe in that stuff. This is again the oral Torah. You're saying this, you're saying that. I don't believe in this stuff. I believe what it says. We could learn the Chumash, we could see what it says, and I don't realize why I have to support you and your yeshiva. So the Rabbi Gordon said, look, you're making a mistake. I'll prove to you that you have to support our yeshiva because you need the oral Torah or else you won't understand. And he says, look, you have to look at it this way, okay? He says, let's go to Parashat Bamidbar. Parashat Bamidbar talks about the amount of firstborns who existed in the nation. Now, let's go with the small figure, which is not an accurate figure because there are many that were not included in the census, which the Torah says was for men between the age of 20 and 60. Let's go with the small figure of 600,000 men. How many firstborns were there of the 600,000 men? In this group of 600,000 men, how many firstborns were there? 22,000. That means that of 600,000 men, you had 22,000 firstborns, which gets you to at least around 27 kids per family. Now he says, you mean to tell me that each mom was popping out 27 kids, 27 different pregnancies? Very hard to imagine. He says, but that's even more than that. You see, the firstborns were counted actually from age 1 month and up, which means that there are by far more people who could have been included, who were included rather in this count of firstborns, right? Relative to the not so many people that were included in the count of the 600,000. So being more realistic, if you want to count the Jewish people, because again, it's only from 20 to 60, what about all the teens? What about all the adults above 60, right? So you had plenty more. It's probably double. So that means that you're looking at 22,000 firstborns for, let's say, 1.2 million people. You're talking about like 50 kids per family. He says you didn't think about it that way, right? So in other words, if you look at it that way, the only way that this could be is if you had sextuplets every single time. So we have over here just these are the Rashi Yeshivot. They look at details that not everybody looks at. It's a very interesting way of looking at it. Now, let's go back to the actual plague of the blood. So it says that they go ahead and they do the plague of blood. Aaron hits the water, the blood comes out. Okay, the rivers are blood. What does it say next? It says that Paro calls his sorcerers, and they do the same thing. They take water, they turn it to blood. There's a big question over here. Meshech Chochmah asked this question. He says, I don't understand. Didn't we say that the blood went everywhere? So if the blood was everywhere, how is it that Paro, that his sorcerers had water to turn into blood? They shouldn't have had any blood. They shouldn't have had any water. Everything is blood. So he answers very interestingly. He says, Paro was rewarded for the fact that Moshe was raised in his house. So even though it's true at this point, probably it's not the same Paro that raised Moshe, which the Torah says the other one died. Let's say it could be different ways of understanding it, but the point is that Moshe Rabbeinu was raised in this house. Since Moshe Rabbeinu was raised in this palace, so Hashem rewarded that palace that there will still be water over there. So while everybody else in Egypt doesn't have water, Paro's palace does, interestingly enough. So that's where they got the water from, and they were able to then turn it into blood based on their sorcery. Now, let's talk about the sorcery of the Egyptians for a second. There's a very interesting Malbim. The Malbim over here talks about the fact that Paro was really not disturbed by the trick that Moshe and Aaron did, where they threw the snake on the ground, the stick on the ground, and then it became a snake, right? This was something that really didn't scare them at all. Now it says over here that they did it, they decided to show the, they decided to do the same thing, right? They decided to go ahead and to do the same act of taking their staffs, throw it on the ground, right? And have it become a snake. So the word that's used is the following. Paro called his wise men and his mechashfim, which means his sorcerers. They did it, the sorcerers of Egypt did it also. Now the key word here is be-la-ha-tehem. What does be-la-ha-tehem mean? So over here in Art Scroll, they translate it as were their incantations. If you look in the Malbim though, so that's Rashi, but if you look in the Malbim, he says it a little differently. He says that they did it with their sleight of hand. Meaning, the Malbim says that what the Egyptian sorcerers did was fake. It wasn't real. It was phony baloney. It was the good old gorilla suit, or in this case, the snake suit, where you have somebody inside or something inside moving around looking like as if it's a snake, but it's not real. It's not real sorcery. And this famously is the opinion of the Rambam as well. The Rambam was of the view that there is no such thing as black magic. All of that stuff is nonsense. And if you believe in it, you're a fool, the Rambam writes. Very interesting. And so interesting because who believes it? Who goes against the Rambam's opinion? The Ramban. None other than the great Ramban, who says to the Rambam, no, that's not correct at all. Actually, this is real and this is true, and it's the kochot atuma, it's the powers of impurity that are at work over here. And it's very real. So you have a big dispute here between the Rambam and the Ramban. But nevertheless, the Malbim says over here, the word belahatehem means that the whole thing was fake, phony baloney. Aharon's staff actually turned into a snake. Theirs didn't, but it looked like it did. From here, there's a very interesting halacha that comes out. You should know, it's a good thing to discuss sometimes halachot in the Parsha class as well, which is that sometimes you'll go to a party, you'll see a magician, and the magician is doing all kinds of cool tricks, pulling a bunny out of the hat, a long chain of all kinds of stuff coming out of his ears, etc., or out of his throat, all types of things, which are very cool and intriguing and interesting, and people are very entertained by it. So the question is one allowed to do that kind of an act? where you trick people into thinking that you're actually doing magic and you know that you're not. So the Rambam's position was, and again, this is the Rambam, so it's heavily codified in halacha by many authorities, that the Rambam's view was that one is not permitted to go ahead and to make some kind of sleight of hand while intentionally trying to make the person observing him think that he's doing magic, that he's doing something that is, some kind of supernatural type of a thing that he's got going on over there. The Rambam held it is forbidden. And it's important to realize that Chacham Ovadia Yosef alav shalom brought down many authorities who paskin this Rambam la'alacha, which means that they felt, and he felt la'alacha, that it is asur for a Jew to be a magician, which is quite an amazing thing. He felt that it's forbidden to do so because of this Rambam, that the Rambam explained that it is forbidden for a Jew to try and to do things by sleight of hand to make the other person think that he's actually doing magic, which is really very interesting. So what then can be done? So others suggested, I don't believe Chacham Vadia agreed with this, but they say over from Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzidk Libracha, and others as well, that at the very least, if someone is able to, if someone who is going to be doing this kind of a show could first off just announce, look, I'm doing this, but it's not really magic. It's not really anything supernatural. It's not something, it's just my hands work very quickly. And they actually recommend that he shows them a trick, how he actually does it. So they get the idea that, if you work your hands fast enough, you could really appear as if you're doing something that's not really, that it's not really supernatural, but it looks that way. Matov, that would be even better. So that at the very least, if somebody's going into it, then somebody should be aware of that point. Chacham Ovadia, however, felt a Jew shouldn't do it. As a matter of fact, he said, if you want to get it done, ask a goy to do it, because the goy doesn't have a problem of doing this, but a Jew does. So therefore, he felt that that's something that should be important for people to